So has this ever happened to you? When you don't want to have sex with the narcissistic person and then you're told you're the one with intimacy issues? Let's take that one on because it comes up a lot. When you're pissed off at someone or resentful or hurt or don't feel psychologically safe with someone, you really don't want to snuggle up to them. Hell, you don't even want to talk to them. And in most cases, you do not want to have sex with them. In general, though not always, in relationships, people want to have sex with someone they feel connected to. Well, that starts to erode really quickly in a narcissistic relationship. Sex is a very fraught space in narcissistic relationships. In some cases, it was often very exciting. There was hot sex for a minute, maybe even longer than a minute. The grandiosity of the narcissistic person can make it all really performative. And like I said, really hot for a time. But as the relationship feels less and less stable and more confusing, sex can feel a lot trickier. And in some cases, sex is the only point of connection in the narcissistic relationship. As the devalue and discard stages kick in, the manipulation increases in volume and the betrayals start happening. You feel emotionally and psychologically disconnected. But some people will say the sex is sometimes the only time to feel at all close to the narcissistic person. And if you are trauma bonded to them, the sex may be on that list of the good stuff that keeps you in the game and may also leave you feeling as though the narcissistic person is still in it with you, still your person, that some of the magic is still there, even though you are feeling more and more psychologically unsafe and disconnected. And in some cases, as everything in the relationship falls apart, the sex is the one thing that works. And some folks will say that the most difficult thing to sort of consider stepping away from was the sex, that physically it worked and was a release and a sort of pseudo connection to the narcissistic person. Again, that's a big trauma bonded kind of thing to get unstuck from. And these people will also say that they became quite compartmentalized about what was happening in the relationship, which over time took a toll on them and often magnified the trauma bond. Now, some people keep having sex while they are in a narcissistic relationship because it is easier than the fight. This is actually not a healthy precedent. It can even feel less than consensual. But you do it not for physical closeness or connection, but to avoid the fight. And this can slowly make sex a very unhealthy place for people. With many folks in that situation saying that it took years after the narcissistic relationship was over for sex to feel like a healthy place again. But what seems to happen most often is that the sex drops off, and there can be many reasons for that. In some cases, it's because the narcissistic person may be getting it elsewhere or watching porn or both. It could be the life happens stuff, stress, kids, work. But the effects of this are even worse because you do not feel supported in the relationship. In some cases, it's because you just don't want to do it anymore because you just don't like being with them. You don't respect them. And some folks have said, I didn't really put together that I was feeling psychologically unsafe in the relationship, but it sort of felt physically intolerable to have sex with them. And sex is one of those measurable things. You're having it or you are not. Now, when the frequency of sex drops in a narcissistic relationship, it will get weaponized. It will become the rationalization for them having sex or watching porn or whatever it is they are doing. They'll say something like, well, you stopped having sex with me. It will be You don't even care enough about me to have sex with me, etc., etc. I am sure you all have lots of things that were said to you about sex in your narcissistic relationship. But you may think it's true. I'm not having sex, or not nearly as much with them. I don't want to. And if you actually went in and said why you are not having sex with them, you're mean to me, that's why I don't have sex with you, or you don't help me with anything, or I'm exhausted because you're never around, or you never help, and you have no empathy, and I don't feel safe with you, they're not going to hear that. They're going to gaslight you. And you will not only feel more invalidated, you'll become more confused and probably still don't want to have sex with them. And here is the ringer. The narcissistic person may say to you, well, you're avoiding intimacy, or you lack intimacy, or that you just aren't an intimate person, and that you are the one who is avoidant, or distant, or cold. And again, if you try to share with them the psychological origin of this distance and where it's coming from you, you're going to be gaslighted. So you can't have the conversation, or they're going to turn around and say, oh, you're trying to blame me for not having sex with me. Try winning that argument. So intimacy is a complicated, complex word. We try to oversimplify it, and a lot of people make intimacy just about sex. And we forget that sex is only one piece of the intimacy pie. Intimacy is closeness, touch, trust, warmth, connection, presence, genuine care for another person. Frankly, I think it also includes safety. And interestingly, when we look at the diagnostic model of the narcissistic personality, the lack of capacity for intimacy is a defining characteristic in narcissism. They have a lack of interest in mutual and sustained relationships. They view relationships as a place of personal gain and benefit with little regard for the other person. The mutual part is key. Intimacy is the reciprocity of a relationship. The care and interest and trust and closeness felt on both sides. Narcissistic people may be good at the sex part, sometimes but not always, but not the closeness part. And that closeness part is the trunk of the intimacy tree, double entendre noted. But when the frequency of sex drops, and it's the partner who is not antagonistic or narcissistic, who is less interested in sex, then it's that not wanting to have sex partner who may be viewed as withholding, cold, and distant. Hell, you may even go into couples therapy and be told that sex and intimacy are an important part of a relationship, and walk out of that room feeling like you're the problem, you're the closed off, proverbially frigid one. And what happened is that actually the so-called avoidance of intimacy, the distance, and that lack of safety was almost entirely created by the narcissistic person's behavior. And again, you weren't feeling safe, you weren't feeling it, but because sex is more measurable, if that's not happening, then it is quite often the case that you feel like you're the problem because it is a material fact if you're not having sex. But that other stuff sometimes is harder to communicate in a place like couples therapy. Now, the capacity of narcissistic people to objectify and compartmentalize people means that they can do that with sex. They could say mean things to you at 6 p.m. and still think that you're going to be in the mood for sex at 10 p.m. And most people don't work that way. Listen, until relatively recently, having sex was sort of a required part of marriage. And before we had reforms and divorce laws, at least in the United States, not having sex with someone was an allowable reason for a divorce, but emotional abuse, of course, was not. As with most things in narcissistic relationships, you will not be able to get through to them and explain to them the why of your not feeling physically connected to them. However, this idea that the person who is pulling back on wanting to have sex is the one with the intimacy issues in the relationship misses the boat on the larger spectrum of what intimacy is. In most cases, for most people, Having sex when you feel devalued and psychologically unsafe is simply not good for you. And since feeling devalued and psychologically unsafe is such a common state in one of these relationships, it is no wonder that sexual intimacy fades. That's not to say it doesn't hurt if the narcissistic partner betrays you sexually, and that betrayal may also be something that plays into not wanting to have sex with them. And in most cases, the narcissistic person will tell you that you are holding a grudge if you stay in the relationship after a sexual betrayal or infidelity, and yet it is a very hard thing to get past. So, what do? Before you go into couples therapy, if you go into couples therapy, it is essential you go into your own therapy first with someone who understands either trauma or narcissistic abuse, or ideally both. Explore this. It's too easy to fall into the, well, maybe I'm the problem. I'm the one who doesn't want to have sex with them. This is such a common issue in narcissistic, close, committed relationships, intimate relationships, and even more common that you will take on the entire burden of responsibility for withholding intimacy in the relationship. And that can pile onto all of the self-blame that you are already going through in the relationship. Intimacy is a two-way street. And when someone leaves you feeling unsafe, they have poisoned the well of intimacy. When we feel unsafe or unsettled, it is often our bodies that sense that first. So while you may get branded with that label of you're the one who's intimacy avoidant, you're the one who's cold, and it's an easy thing to fall for because it's easy to measure that sex part, keep in mind that you're very likely responding to something within yourself that this doesn't feel right. So before you're willing to take that one on, pay attention, explore it, and be curious about it. Thanks again.